Under the Chesapeake?
Tobacco.
Well, we would do tobacco. Okay, why would we do that?
It's the main cash crop.
It's the main cash crop. What name would we associate with tobacco?
John.
John Rolfe. And what else? What else? Besides tobacco in the Chesapeake, and I would say this is pretty important because that's what defines this area. How does it define it? How does tobacco define this area? Because they can grow tobacco in the Chesapeake, what other things are connected to that? Go ahead, Wallace.
Plantations.
So then you have plantations, and those plantations are large farms that are spread out. All right. And those plantations need labor on it. Yes, go ahead.
Indentured servants.
So then you have indentured servants. And eventually you have slaves that work on this plantation. Are there any people that we would associate with the Chesapeake region? Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, like, you have more males than females because, like, everybody was, like, there.
All right, so we've got more males and fewer families. All right, fewer towns, fewer churches, fewer schools, all right, in the Chesapeake. And that all has a lot to do with tobacco, and it has a lot to do with the people that came over. But in Maryland, there is one thing that we would point out. We said we got the Religious Toleration Act. I mean, we did this the other day. All right, in Virginia, the one name that I would associate with Virginia is John Smith. You know, it is that forceful leadership of John Smith that is part of the Virginia Company that keeps the colony going initially. But this is kind of good you put here. There's no more males, fewer families, fewer towns, fewer churches, fewer schools, you know, and that's very much related to the fact that it's a tobacco plantation economy, indentured servants and slaves. It's going to result in some level of the social hierarchy. All right? You know, where you have, the plantation owners at the top, you don't have much of a middle class, and then you have indentured servants and slaves at the bottom. Now, as that's being settled, because remember, you've got in Virginia, and we probably concluded with the House of Burgess and the first slaves, and eventually that joint stock company gives way. For some reason, people are interested in this. That joint stock company gives way to it being a royal colony. The crown takes over Virginia eventually, and Maryland is a proprietary colony all the way up unto the Revolution. So right up into the Revolution, the heirs of the Calvert family are possess Maryland. They're appointing, governors right up into the Revolution. Same with Pennsylvania. But we know that area of North America, British North America, is the first to establish a permanent settlement. We know that the second to establish a permanent settlement is New England, right? And in New England, we know that Plymouth is the first colony. And so when we think of Plymouth, obviously, what comes to our mind is the Pilgrims. But did you remember what we said? What kind of historical significance? How is that going to sort of develop differently? How is the New England settlement going to develop differently than the Chesapeake settlement? I mean, New England, they go to, the Pilgrims go there 1619, yes?
They didn't go there for a public, they went there
So the Pilgrims went there kind of fleeing persecution, and so religion is going to be important. So to some extent, you've got to have a familiarity with the sort of religious conflict that caused the Puritans to flee England. What was the religious conflict? So the Puritans are fleeing persecution. Why is this tiny congregation being persecuted? Go ahead, Andrew.
They wanted to purify the Church of England.
So it had to do with the nature of the Church of England, right? So the Church of England is the state-sponsored, supported church of England, correct? And that Church of England was Catholic or Protestant?
Protestant.
It was Protestant. And when you say Protestant, what did that mean? I mean, where did this sort of notion of Protestantism emanate from? Yes.
Martin Luther?
Yes. So we went back all the way to the Protestant Reformation. And we did a lot of theology when we did that. When we went back to the Protestant Reformation, we did a lot of theology, and we talked about Luther's disputes with the Pope and with the Catholic Church. And I guess most significantly, eventually those who supported Luther's ideas began to refer to themselves as those who protest or Protestants. All right? And this Protestant Reformation, divides Europe. I mean, there are some countries that cling to Catholicism, most prominently Spain. Certainly France remains Catholic. Spain remains Catholic. Italy's not really a country, but the Italian city-states, including Rome and the Vatican, remain Catholic. Parts of Germany continued, which is not really a country yet, it is, remain Catholic. But other places move towards Protestantism, and the most prominent of those places is England. Now, not that I think that there'd be anything on the test about this, the AP test, but how is it that England becomes Protestant? Andrew, this is your life, because this is your heritage, your people. Your people come from England, yes.
The king, he wanted to get an annulment on his marriage, and the Pope wouldn't grant it, so he basically replaced the Pope with himself.
Yes.
The church.
Yes, King Henry VIII wants his marriage to Catherine of Aragon annulled. When the Pope refuses to do that, Henry basically, with the support of Parliament, pulls the Church of England out from underneath the leadership of Rome and declares it the Church of England with he at the head, and then appointing bishops and kind of the defender of that of that faith. Now, I should tell you this, not that you care, but I'll tell you anyways, that if you were really studying this, like if this was more consequential to our discussion, there's far more to that story. You almost get the picture that Henry VIII pulled, wanted this for kind of reasons of love, maybe, yes, who knows. I mean, it's a complicated religious, political, economic story. There's far more to the story. So I don't want you to go off into higher ed and when you find this out, think that I kept it from you. I did keep it from you, but for our purposes, all we need to know that eventually the Church of England is separated from Rome. So now with that being said, what do the Pilgrims and the Puritans want to do? The Church of England is separated from Rome, but there's still a problem. There's still, yes?
They feel that it's corrupt.
Yes, they feel that the Church of England is corrupt by the vestiges of Catholicism. So when they broke the Church of England away from the Church of Rome, they didn't really change the Church of England. And the Protestants, or the Puritans and the Pilgrims wanted to do so. I mean, the Pilgrims had given up on it, but the Puritans wanted to do so. They wanted to sort of shed all the vestiges of Catholicism. And the kind of ideological and spiritual leader of really kind of true Protestantism was whom? And these are who the Puritans and we're going to talk about this in a second, but their ideological leader, the person that they kind of want to follow is whom? Do you remember? Alex, you remember now?
Was it Winthrop?
Not Winthrop. Calvin. They were Calvinists, right? They were Calvinists. And so, are they coming?
Yeah.
Our friends are coming. Are they right behind you?
Yeah.
Well, we'll tarry. We'll tarry for a moment until they get here. We'll tarry. How was that rehearsal? Stuffed potato worms, what's that? Just, kind of wrote some things down about the Chesapeake. Ordinarily I won't do that. I won't kind of review what we already reviewed. But we did that, and then we kind of segued over to New England. And what we said is, look, 1606 to 1619, Chesapeake is kind of fledgling there, but it's an established British settlement. In 1619, the Puritans land in Plymouth. I'm pretty sure it's 1619. They land in Plymouth, and now you have kind of this establishment of New England, with first the Puritan or the Pilgrims going to to Plymouth, and then eventually, the big migration of settlers to Massachusetts Bay. And we said, what's fundamentally the difference between these two settlements? Well, both people that go to both places are both British, primarily English. That's true, but we said one of the big differences between those two settlements is that these people that go to New England, at least the initial movement of people, have a significant religious motivation. And that significant religious motivation is certainly tied to their Calvinist heritage. Our other friend, they're coming, is tied to their Calvinist heritage. And we were teasing out of the kids, teasing it out of them, what Calvinism was about, and what we concluded, just to summarize for those of you that came in after that trying rehearsal that you were involved with Mr. Sean Whelan. Yes, he's very calm and generally happy during that time. But before you came, we were kind of teasing out, okay, what's this all about here? Why are the Pilgrims fleeing? What's the problem? And we concluded that they represented a faction of Protestants that wanted to change the Church of England, right? And we were kind of saying, well, how do they want to change the Church of England? They want to purify the Church of England, rid the Church of England of all its vestiges of Catholicism, and establish a Church of England that is more primarily based on Calvinism. Now, it raises this question, so what? Why would the King of England be concerned about, sort of a religious dissent against the Church of England? So it was rid of its vestiges of Catholicism. So it's more based on Calvinism. Big deal. Well, there are ramifications to that. Calvinism puts less, emphasis on a hierarchy. The king was the head of the church, and he had power as the head of the church, and political power. To challenge his religious authority was to challenge his political authority, and those things kind of result in the Pilgrims, who are separatists. The Pilgrims are not necessarily technically Puritans; they're separatists. They want to separate entirely from the Church of England. So they don't want to be part of it at all. They think it's hopeless. It can't be reformed. And so they flee to Holland. Eventually they flee to North America. They expect to land in the territory of the Virginia Company. They do not. When they don't land in the territory of the Virginia Company, remember, they do establish something called the Mayflower Compact. All right? And I'm wondering, how is this important? Mayflower Compact, but I guess it is sort of a statement of self-government. That the people that jumped off that boat at Plymouth said, look, we are going to govern ourselves, right? We're going to make laws that we mutually abide by. Now, the Pilgrim migration is really consequential only because it established Thanksgiving, right? The real giant migration is the migration to Massachusetts Bay. Massachusetts Bay is a significant colony that is founded by wealthy Puritans who had come to believe that their time in England was over. And they migrated in large numbers beginning in, really, the colony was established. It was a joint stock company, in theory a profit-making venture, right, that was established in 1629. The first settlers are going to come in 1630, and between 1630 and 1640 we have that great migration of Puritans who leave England in large numbers and come to Massachusetts Bay. Now, when I did it at the time, I mentioned, and it's in your books there, I mentioned John Winthrop. And I said that Winthrop is one of the principals of the Massachusetts Bay Company. Eventually, he is going to be consistently elected as governor of that colony by the company. It is a company, right? It is a company. But we said, when we talked about Winthrop, we put him on the Arabella. We read to you part of his sermon on the Arabella, the model for Christian charity. And in that sermon, we said there was kind of a line, an enduring line, a phrase. Do you remember we said Winthrop implored the people, and talking about why they were doing what they were going to do. I mean, there were lots of ships traveling to Massachusetts Bay. So they said, this is why we're going here. We're going here for this reason. We are going to be what? Do you remember? Yes.
City on a hill?
City on a hill. Now, here's why I kind of reemphasize that. That notion of a city on a hill establishes some level of a sense of mission. And there are going to be a lot of people that argue that that defines U.S. history. That this sense of mission, that we're particular, that we're special, that we're exceptional, right, is going to define U.S. history. So you know, not that I don't want you to do this just to do it, but sometimes when you're writing an essay, and you're writing an essay about the 60s, and you can somehow connect it to something that happened long before that, then the reader of the essay, and you can do it intelligently, then the reader of that essay might think, well, gee, this person knows something about history, right? You know, they know that this notion that they're writing about now is not something that's isolated, it's connected to other things in the past. And this notion of a sense of history with Winthrop and a model of Christian charity on the Arabella is something that you could do that with, right? So that's why we reemphasize it now. But nevertheless, you know, Massachusetts Bay was established, a large number of people that came there. And what we said is that those people came in and established towns, right, that had churches, right, and they had families, right, in small farms. Now, when we went over here, we said, look, in the Chesapeake, tobacco is the big deal, right? And there were more males than females, few families, fewer towns, fewer churches, fewer schools. In New England, we got towns, churches, families, farms, schools. In fact, you've got mandated public education in New England. Now, why do you have that? Well, this is part of it, certainly, the emphasis on religion, just as this would be part of it here, right? And when we say social hierarchy, because of the plantations, the tobacco in New England, or excuse me, in the Chesapeake, you do have a greater stratification in society than you would ordinarily have. You know, not that you would ordinarily have, than you had in New England. And in New England, you know, you have some level of stratification as well, but that stratification in New England might be more religious than it is economic, right? I mean, remember, the Calvinistic notion was that there was an elect that were chosen by God to be saved. And they were the only people who could be part of the Puritan church. And they were the only people who eventually at some point could vote in Massachusetts Bay. So it was, at least initially, considered to be sort of this holy commonwealth that was, you know, had this sense of mission to show the world just how good it could be. And that, on some level, defines it. Now, I mean, so you kind of have this difference. And this is a big deal. I mean, some people suggest that this lays the roots of the Civil War. You know, I mean, on one side you have what's happening there, and on another side you have what's happening in New England, and eventually this is going to result in a conflict. It just takes until 1860 for that to occur. Now, there certainly could be more said. Is there anything else you would want me to add over here to New England? You know, I mean, I just throw things on there. Anything you remember, anything you think is significant, anything that you would write or say about New England besides the, the Plymouth colony, Massachusetts Bay, Winthrop, the sense of mission, how it defines the colony, small farms. Now, one thing else to point out is topography and climate are kind of the underlying things that either reinforce or in some people's minds create. If there is a different topography and climate in the Chesapeake region, does everything work out the way that it does? If there's a different topography and climate in New England, does everything work out the way that it does? I mean, it is true that they wanted to settle in communities so that they could be in church and keep an eye on each other. That's certainly the case. But it's also the case that they didn't have the opportunity to spread out. I mean, you had a rocky soil, you had mountainous terrain, hilly terrain, whereas in the Chesapeake, you did have the opportunity to spread out. Okay, let's mention this. In New England, you had this sense of mission, sense of community, but you also had dissenters from that. And you remember we talked about these famous dissenters. We talked about two. We talked about Anne Hutchinson and Roger Williams. The AP loves Anne Hutchinson. They love Anne Hutchinson. They love Anne Hutchinson because she kills two birds with one stone. One, she is a woman, right? And as a woman, she is challenging a male-dominated society on the basis of theology. And the other is she is I guess, having a theological dispute that challenges kind of the basis of that society. The result is that Hutchinson is banished from the colony. Right? She is banished from there. As is Roger Williams. Roger Williams also banished from Massachusetts Bay. When Williams leaves Massachusetts Bay, he kind of goes south and establishes a town, Providence, which eventually becomes in 1644 a colony. Rhode Island becomes a haven for people who had gone from somewhere else that weren't able to get along, that were looking for opportunity, or had fled what they considered to be errors or oppression in Massachusetts Bay. So it becomes a spillover colony for Massachusetts Bay, but it is an independently established and chartered colony by the British Crown by 1644. And its capital is going to be Providence. Now, in addition to Rhode Island, also in New England, there is Connecticut. Connecticut was established by the Reverend Thomas Hooker in 1639. I'm not fully sure. 1636 they had it here. 1636 is the Reverend Thomas Hooker, and that's in Connecticut. New Hampshire is 1636. New Hampshire, I'm not sure when New Hampshire was actually chartered, but eventually you are going to have Plymouth, Massachusetts Bay, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and New Hampshire making up the New England colonies, and you're going to have Virginia and Maryland making up the southern colonies. And that's where we kind of left it before, we established these colonies. And then it's not really the organization of your book. Your book doesn't organize it that way. We did. And then we said, okay, these colonies were established before the Restoration. And then there were colonies established after the Restoration. And remember, we said the Restoration was the restoration of the king to the throne. King Charles II was restored to the throne after the English Civil War in 1660. Yes, 1660. Is that right? 1660.
Chesty. Didn't sound too far off.
I'm struggling with the dates today. Yes, I'm pretty sure it's 1660. In 1660, and in the aftermath of his restoration to the throne, he's going to reward some of his people that supported him with proprietary grants. And one of those proprietary grants are going to be to a group of supporters who established a colony south of Virginia but north of Florida. They named the colony after Charles, Carolina. And I think Carolina is chartered in 63 and established in 1670. So Carolina is chartered in 1663 and established, actually settled in 1670. Now, probably not a lot of things to remember about the Carolinas or Carolina, but what do you remember? Do you remember anything? I mean, there should be something that sticks out in your mind, yes? Yes, one thing is they divided between North and South. Why was that the case, Mandela? Why did the Carolinas divide?
I don't know.
You do not remember, but if I were to call upon Belay, she would certainly recall why the Carolinas divided into North and South. Because one was in the North and one was in the South. Would that be the biggest reason? Yes?
I think the South had big plantations of slaves in Barbados and the North had small colonies.
Yes. The southern part of Carolina was more plantation-based. But what did they grow? Woo. Pardon me? What did he say? Tell me what he said. Not indigo, rice. Remember? It was the rice plantations of the southern parts of Carolina, which were the largest and potentially most lucrative in all of British North America. But growing that rice in the southern part of Carolina was labor intensive. The most important thing to remember about the establishment of Carolina is that the proprietors that established it had connections with Barbados. And Barbados was a British sugar island. And in Barbados, slavery thrived. And the Barbadian connection between, Barbados and South Carolina really leads to the establishment of slavery there, slave codes there, and really kind of codifies, slavery in America. Now that is true that there were slaves in Virginia in 1619. But they weren't consequential really until about 1700. And by that time, it was the southern part of Carolina that really led the way in establishing slavery. Now, again, go to the Civil War. What state was the first to secede from the Union when they perceived that there was at least some threat to the institution of slavery? Well, it was South Carolina. Where did this all start? It all starts in South Carolina to some extent. Charlestown, which eventually becomes Charleston, is the heart of that connection between Barbados and Carolina. And Dan is right. The northern part of Carolina took on a separate existence because it didn't have rice plantations. It didn't have a good harbor. It didn't have, the other kind of geographic attributes that the southern part of Carolina had. So we said Northern Carolina was a place where people who spilled over from other places went. People that were unhappy in the southern part of Carolina or Virginia or in other places migrated into Northern Carolina. And that was a colony that was established with smaller farms, less social stratification. Anywhere where there were plantations, that were labor intensive, it seemed that coupled with that was social stratification. An upper class that controlled that plantation and an underclass that worked on it. Now, in addition to the Carolinas, we also said some post-restoration colonies included New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware. They were the middle colonies. Both Pennsylvania, we could put them right here, right? We could put PA, NY, NJ, and DE. They're in the middle, get it? There you go, the middle colonies. The significant ones of those are New York and Pennsylvania. They are both proprietary grants. New York is granted by Charles II to his brother James II, and we said there was one big significant thing about the establishment of New York? Do you recall? Go ahead, Josh.
It was originally the Dutch.
Yes, it was originally a Dutch settlement. It was originally the New Netherlands, and the British never recognized the Netherlands' claim to that area. The Netherlands didn't hold on to that area very, very stringently, and they didn't manage it, very effectively. And the people that lived there were widely diverse and not in love with the kind of autocratic company government. I think it was the British East India Company that, West India Company. British, not British, you said. Say it. Go ahead, Nora. No, it would be the Dutch West India Company. Is that right? Hold on, I can't stand it. I have to get it right. Doesn't say. That's probably why I don't know, Joe. But anyways, it's a Dutch proprietary, or a Dutch company that controls that colony, and they don't hold it very, stringently. And so when the British come to take over, the Dutch that live there aren't really willing to defend it. The British take it without a shot, and they take over that area, rename the colony New York, rename the capital city New York City. And what kind of distinguishes it from the beginning is that it is diverse, particularly in New York City. Lots of different religions, lots of different ethnicities. But there is also large Dutch and eventually British landholders along the Hudson River. And so there is an element of aristocracy in New York. What's interesting is New York is one of the last northern states to abandon slavery. And even, when they do abandon slavery, in colonial times of all the northern states, New York is going to have more slaves than any other northern state, which is kind of interesting because they have more, they have a greater social stratification than any of the other northern colonies. New Jersey is just a spillover colony from New York, and that takes us quickly to Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania, we talked about extensively, was founded by William Penn. Penn established that as a place for persecuted Quakers to come, but it was more than that. Penn's Pennsylvania, he called a holy experiment. He wanted to provide a place where anybody could come and practice their religion freely, which he did. He also provided for the settlers that went there generous grants of very, very good land. He planned the capital city, Philadelphia, himself personally. I'm sure when you go with Mr. Spinola on the trip to Philadelphia that they'll tell you all about Penn's vision for Philadelphia, his plans for it. I guess, Philadelphia is significant, or not Philadelphia, Pennsylvania is significant in its ambition, what it aspired to do. But it's also significant in that it drew settlers from all over Europe. And what you get in the middle colonies is this. These are the most widely diverse colonies. In both the Chesapeake and New England, you don't have the level of diversity. Half the people that lived in the middle colonies were not English. There were lots of Germans and Swedes and Dutch and other ethnicities that went into these places. There was far more religious toleration in these areas, particularly in Pennsylvania. The farm sizes were larger than they were in New England, smaller than they were in the Chesapeake region. There was a more egalitarian attitude there and less of a connection to Britain generally in the middle colonies. Now, what you have in America by 1700 is 12, very diverse colonies that are only really associated with each other as being British, as being fundamentally British colonies. Which really takes us to kind of a big question about all of this. Here are this, and I don't know how much discussion on the AP test there is going to be about the settlement of British North America, which we just quickly went through. You know, we established these colonies, and we did it in class, and we talked about them in class, and, you know, we talked about Pennsylvania, and New York, and New Jersey, the restoration, the importance of religion, topography, geography, the differences between these colonies, the Chesapeake, etc. I don't know how much is going to be on the test about that. There'll certainly be some questions about it, you know, and there may even be essay questions about it. Frequently there are. But certainly the biggest question is why? Why did these colonies eventually unite and revolt? You know, I mean, because that's what ultimately establishes the United States. These colonies are not affiliated or associated with one another in any manner beyond simply being British and close to one another. You know, I mean, there is no intercolonial connections per se. There may have been trade relations between colonial possessions, but they are not connected in any governmental manner. Now, there are some things that they share. One of them is, well, let's do this. I was going to say mercantilism, but let's wait with mercantilism. They do share some kind of intellectual connection. They certainly share cultural connections in that they are British-based, but they also share some intellectual connections in that they are greatly influenced by the Enlightenment. If you were to describe the Enlightenment, the European Enlightenment, what is there a word that comes to mind? Ben, is there a word that comes to mind when you think of the European Enlightenment? A phrase, a word, any. Well, it is a change in thinking. Go ahead, Luke.
I would say like secularism.
Secularism is not a bad word, right? Yes, go ahead. Science is a pretty good word. Yes.
Enlightened despots.
Enlightened despots. Well, that's two words.
I cheated.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I guess, to me, Regina, I would argue this: reason. Reason. Science isn't bad. Rationality isn't bad. Reason seems to be a word that embodies the spirit of the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment is kind of this intellectual movement that rejects superstition and religion as the explanation as to how things work and how the world is. But I wanted to say this too, because I think this is important. There is a fundamental notion that underlines the Enlightenment that you know, we kind of were talking about when we talked about World War I. And that is that human beings can actually figure out their world and make it better. And I don't know if you probably didn't catch this or weren't thinking about it, but in World War I, there was such utter destruction, death, and devastation. And lots of that death and devastation was connected to technological advances, science. And so, on some level, World War I, and then to a great extent World War II, is going to challenge the Enlightenment. And so Wilson, who's a child of the Enlightenment on some level, comes in and says, well, we can't let this happen. We can't let humanity sort of be left with this utter destruction. We've got to do something. We've got to become better. We've got to fulfill the enlightened spirit that humans can make the world better. Because World War I is not evidence of that. You know, World War I is evidence of the contrary. And so, on some level, that's why Wilson is trying to do what he wants to do, and that's why other liberal and enlightened thinkers are emphasizing that we have to do this. We have to solve our problems in different ways. We have to show the world, yes, that things can be better. So this kind of spirit of enlightenment is present in Europe, and it spreads to the United States, and it's, you know, not the United States, to the American colonies. And it's manifested in a number of ways. One way that it's manifested is in an emphasis on science. And that's where you have Benjamin Franklin and, you know, the idea of reason and the scientific method, and things can be figured out and the world is knowable. And, you know, I mean, these are ideas of the Enlightenment. right? And Franklin represents that. You know, he tinkers with science and, you know, things like that, and stresses, you know, the scientific method, and things can be understandable. And if you think about it, tinkering with that stuff kind of it suggests that the world can be better. But the other element of the Enlightenment is in sort of human interactions, that human beings can make their societies better, right? That there can be enlightened government, that people can govern themselves because they're inherently good. So the Enlightenment is important in sort of, you know, understanding what happens in America. You know, in addition to the Enlightenment, you also have, you know, the Great Awakening as an important intercolonial movement. The Great Awakening is the first of kind of a series of religious revivals that greatly influence the United States. The Great Awakening is really in 1740 through 1742. You know, so this is before there was a United States. There were just American colonies. And the Great Awakening is basically just that, a religious revival. It is a backlash on some level against the Enlightenment, against secularism, against materialism, by people that sort of said that you have to kind of feel it. It's an emotive experience. And remember, what two names do we associate with the Great Awakening? Does anybody recall? We associate two people with the Great Awakening. Go ahead, Worms. Oh, you did not have your hand up. I'm sorry. Go ahead, George.
Jonathan Edwards.
Jonathan Edwards is the theologian of the Great Awakening. And remember, Edwards is going to argue that, look, what people have to do is they've got to kind of viscerally understand and feel kind of their sinfulness. They have to understand how bad they are if they are going to understand how great God's grace is. And it's not enough to just go through the motions. You have to feel it. You have to understand it. It's got to be in your spirit. And then there was George Whitefield. And Whitefield was an itinerant minister. Itinerant means you go from place to place and preach. And remember, we said Whitefield was the first American superstar. He was the first person that was known throughout all of colonial America. He went from place to place and asked for people to convert, to feel, to deliver the message that you know, Winthrop had, not Winthrop, Edwards had delineated. And, you know, we said that there were lots of implications to the Great Awakening. One of them was that people challenged the salvation of their ministers, right? You know, that the ministers in the churches in America, people challenged their salvation. They challenged their authority. They began to go out and preach and teach based on their own personal feeling and inspiration. So they kind of even challenged the social structure in America. You know, and so we say the Awakening and the Enlightenment are two powerful influences that influenced Americans at this time. Another thing that unified these colonies, or they had in commonality, was this idea of mercantilism. So let's talk about that quickly. We did the Carolinas, we did Maryland, we did New Jersey and New York, we did Pennsylvania and Delaware, we did all of that. But you know what we did not do, Joe? Mercantilism. Now, mercantilism is an economic system. And remember, we said this. The goal of mercantilism was to create in an empire a favorable balance of trade. So what mercantilism was established to do, right? Now mercantilism was an economic system that was employed in imperial powers, in empires. And in an empire, you had a mother country and then colonial possessions, right? That's what makes it an empire. In mercantilism was the system that was going to be used. And the goal of mercantilism was to create a favorable balance of trade. A favorable balance of trade means that you export more than you import. Now, the thing that's significant about mercantilism is in order to accomplish that, the mercantilistic idea was that the government of the empire could regulate the economic activity of the empire for the good of the empire. In other words, the government would pass rules and laws that encouraged a favorable balance of trade. It would regulate economic activity for the good of the empire, right? So then you guys can't do this, and you guys can't do that, and these guys are going to do this, and these guys are going to do that, so that we can have a favorable balance of trade. In America, we're not going to let you manufacture your own products. We're going to limit that. We're going to force you to do this, and we're only going to allow you to sell those things to certain people, right? Or not to certain people, to us, or we're only going to allow you to buy from us, or we're going to force you to transport on our vessels, and we're going to do all of this in order to create a favorable balance of trade. So that the economic system of the empire is being regulated by the government to accomplish this goal. Right? Oh, what were the laws that were passed that enforced mercantilism that are so significant? They were passed between, I know the date on this for sure. Josh, I know the date on this for sure, 1660 to 1663. What were they called? This is what enforced mercantilism. Della, do you know? You know, you just don't want to say, don't you? You know, what are they? The Navigation Acts. The Navigation Acts were those laws that were passed. Coulter, these were the laws that put mercantilism into place. Now, if you think about it, it is mercantilism that the colonists, to some extent, revolt from. Right? I mean, you know, colonial America doesn't like the fact that they can't do what they want. You know, the merchants and the planters and the growers and whoever is doing whatever, they don't want to be regulated. Right? They don't want to be regulated for the good of the empire, because inevitably mercantilism enriches the mother country at the expense of the colonial possessions. Now, here's what's interesting about America. America was a colonial possession of Britain, correct? The American colonies were colonial possessions of Britain. The system of mercantilism was in place. There were mercantilistic laws and regulations that were in place. But by the eve of the Revolution, the American colonies were prosperous. And Britain was to some extent devastated by 4 wars for empire. So if mercantilism was intended to enrich the mother country, how come the colonies were so darn wealthy on the eve of the Revolution, and the mother country needed the colonial possessions for money? And why, if mercantilism was such a terrible thing, why does it take the colonists 100 years to actively protest it and to fight against it? Go ahead, say it. I know what you want to say. Go ahead, Dylan, say it. Say it. What defines it? Why did Americans tolerate mercantilism for 100 years before they actively protest? Go ahead, say it. Think of Sean Whelan. Salutary neglect. The man loves salutary neglect, does he not? He's probably up there muttering that right now. Salutary neglect. Unification in German. Salutary neglect. Unification in German. His 2 favorite things. So, the salutary neglect is significant. The fact that Britain doesn't enforce its mercantilistic legislation. Now, one last thing that sets the stage. So here's what we've got, in terms of like our story of history. Okay, we've got North America. And, on some level, if we wanted to go back and, kind of tell the story, if you're in the AP, they'd want to say, okay, we've got North America. Who's here before the British get here? And there may be a question or two about that. All right, then the British come. So we've got settlement. And so now we get 12, and eventually with Georgia, 13 independently chartered and settled colonial possessions that are widely diverse. They are diverse in the people that go there. They are diverse in the economic structure. They are diverse in what's happening in terms of religion. They are diverse in how they interact with Native Americans. They are diverse. Right? But they're all British. They do have commonality. The commonality is they share in the experience of the Enlightenment. There are people in all of those places that are influenced on some level or another by the Enlightenment. Certainly Jefferson and Washington, Madison and others in Virginia were influenced by the Enlightenment. Franklin and Dickinson in the middle colonies were influenced by the Enlightenment. Adams and Otis and others in New England were influenced by the Enlightenment. They are also influenced by religion, the First Great Awakening, and other influences of religion. All of the colonial possessions, in one manner or another, are connected to mercantilism, some more strongly than others. New England never really has a strong mercantilistic connection to England, because they don't have anything, right? They don't have anything to contribute. I mean, New England is never strongly connected. The Chesapeake region is strongly connected. The Carolinas are strongly connected because they do have a mercantilistic relationship. Now, in addition, even though they are diverse, even though they're all under mercantilism, the other thing that they share, maybe not purposefully, is an ideology and system of government. All of the colonial possessions have representative assemblies. Right? They all have representative assemblies. All of them are bicameral, a lower house and an upper house. In all of these colonialists, in all of these colonies, there is a belief in the British system of law, that you have a right to trial by jury, that you are innocent until proven guilty, that your premises can't be searched without certain, permissions being given. There are these ideas of property rights and eventually, and again drawing on the Enlightenment, ideas of natural rights. I mean, there is also kind of a social hierarchy, a recognition that the crown has some status with the governor, an upper house that represents an elite, and a lower house that represents commonality, right, or the common folk. But it's going to be in that context that events occur that set the stage for the revolution. And significant in those events, and we'll start this, when we come back on, when do we come back? Tuesday. So when we come back on Tuesday, we'll do the French and Indian War and the whole American Revolution on Tuesday. Is Tuesday in the day or the night?
What?
What day of the week is it? What is that? That's the 6th, right?
No, it's the 5th.
That's a day. I think that's a All right. Sorry to keep you so long, but it's Sean Whelan's fault. Lucy, it's not my fault. It's Sean Whelan's fault. I blame